Hello everyone, I hope you're having a great SCR 2021 so far. My name is Audrey-Anne Loisel and I'm a PhD student from Montreal University in Quebec, Canada. And today I'm here to present to you the results of the first chapter of my PhD, which is part of a larger project that we call Lake Papineau Project. This project brings together organization and research team from 3 different universities, and together we study the hydrology of Lake Papineau's watershed as well as the diversity and ecology of its wetlands. This collaborative project is realized in collaboration with the people at Canuck Nature, which is a natural reserve and an outfitter of which Lake Papineau is part of. And so my project is centered around wetland ecology and its link with conservation. My main objective is to understand the links between all of the elements that you see here. My focus is on the differences between types of leakage wetlands. So some of the questions that I ask are, how do these different types form? What kind of ecosystem services do they provide? And how is this all going to be affected by climate change and land use changes? And today I'm only going to focus on these elements of the puzzle which relate to my first chapter. But before we go further, let's review some of the basics about leakage wetlands. So what are leakage wetlands? Well, in the literature, leakage wetlands are referred to with a lot of different terms. For instance, in the Laurentian Great Lakes, they are called coastal wetlands or coastal plains. And while riverine wetland is not erroneous, it also englobes wetlands along the shores of rivers, which is quite different. So what does the term leakage wetland means for us here? Well, we refer to ecosystem where hydromorphic soil and hydrophilic vegetation are present along the shores of a lake, but are clearly distinct from it. So they are not ecotones, they are ecosystems that are different from the aquatic and the forested matrix. And even further than that, as I've mentioned before, I'm especially interested in the differences between types of leakage wetlands. As you may know, leakage wetlands are created and maintained by various environmental factors. And in the case of leakage wetlands, previous research has shown that hydrogeomorphic variables are the main predictors of such types. But one predictor stands out for its explanatory power and its water level. The period, frequency, and intensity of flooding events along the shores of a lake exert a selective pressure on plant species according to their traits. The selection process is what shapes plant communities along the toposequence of the shore. As many studies have shown us, climate change will have major impacts on precipitation and temperature, therefore affecting lake hydrology. Land use changes such as logging in a lake's watershed could also affect water levels. So we can wonder, how are these changes going to affect the different types of leakage wetlands? Will they be resilient or not? It is important to note here that while this question has been addressed for large lake systems such as the Laurentian Great Lakes and fluvial lakes, it has barely been studied for the smaller systems. What's the difference? Well, large systems tend to have a very different hydrology with very intense inter- and intra-annual variations. They also show flatter topography and strong dominance of marshes over peatlands and swamps. So our study was designed to fill this knowledge gap, and this is why we focused on leakage wetlands found along the shores of a medium-sized southern boreal lake with rougher topography and where peatland and swamps were dominant. So for this chapter of my project, we asked the following questions. First, what is the link between vegetation, wetland type, and hydrogeomorphology in Lake Papineau? Second, could we predict these types using only hydrogeomorphologic predictors, which I will hereon refer to as HGM predictors? And finally, how will different water level change scenario affect these types of wetlands? Will they be resilient or not? So to answer these questions, we sampled leakage wetlands found along the shores of Lake Papineau. Now, in the 1930s, a dam was built at its main outlet, which raised the water level by approximately 2.4 meters. This large raise probably led to major changes in leakage wetlands and also in surface water connectivity. While it has now been replaced by a weir, water levels have stayed high and intra-annual variation is still low compared to larger systems. Remember this detail when we get to the results. Along the shores of Lake Papineau, we found 3 different types of wetlands. Peatlands, often consisting of floating mats, were dominated by ericaceous shrubs and sphagnum mosses. Ash swamps were dominated by Fraxinus nigra, and alder swamps were dominated by Alnus incana subspecies rugosa. And so we sampled the vegetation in 37 of these 3 types of wetlands. We then sampled 12 HGM predictors in each of these sites, but to do so we did not use field data for two reasons. The first one is because we wanted to create a set of variables that could be easily calculated using only geomatic data, making our method easily reproducible anywhere. The second reason is because we wanted to add terrestrial sites to the mix. We wanted to know what are the HGM settings that are associated with the presence or the absence of leakage wetlands along the shores. And so this gave us a total of 55 sites to work with. First, to investigate the link between vegetation, wetland type, and hydrogeomorphology, we used a canonical redundancy analysis. Then, to test whether sites could be predicted using only HGM predictors, we built a random forest model with our 12 variables to classify our 55 sites into 4 categories. This statistical classification model renders a global percentage of accuracy, but also accuracy for each of the category. It also informs us on the importance of each of the different variables used in the model. And finally, to see if wetland type and area were resilient to water level changes, we simulated these changes by modifying the elevation variable. So as shown in the example here, a higher elevation mimics lower water levels, and vice versa. And so we simulated 5 scenarios, plus or minus 0.5 meters, plus or minus 2 meters, and our base scenario, which we call 0 meters. So we simply changed the elevation variable, creating 5 datasets, which we then replugged into our model and then asked, are there any sites that switch typology following this change, and do we lose or gain wetland area? And so here are the results and the discussion. As for the relation between vegetation, wetland type, and hydrogeomorphology predictor, the main results we saw were as follows. Peatlands were particularly unique, while alder and ash swamps seemed to be distributed on a gradient. Site and elevation were very important in defining the different types of wetlands. However, surface water connectivity was particularly important in differentiating ash and alder swamps, where alder swamps showed the greatest hydrological connectivity. As for the results of our model, we saw that HGM predictors alone rendered a very high global accuracy, especially for forested lake edges and peatlands. But our model had more trouble identifying ash and alder swamps. But here again, elevation and slope were the two main predictors. The range we saw in the RDA between ash and alder swamps, as well as the difficulties of our model to classify these two types of sites, could be explained by two things: past water level changes and beaver activity. Now remember at the beginning when I told you to keep in mind the large water level changes that happened following the dam construction? Well, it was for now. So we believe that this major change could have triggered vegetal succession in ecosystems along the shores of the lake. While peatlands on their floating mat could have been more resilient to this large change, ash swamp, alder swamp, and forested lake edges could have gone through a succession process. Now you might wonder, for sites with similar HGM settings, wouldn't they pretty much end up in the same state if they were all affected at the same time by this one past event? Well, that is where beaver activity comes to the stage. Around the lake, we found very heterogeneous beaver activity, with some sites crossed by very large dams and some sites where no traces were found. When they are built, beaver dams create unique hydrological conditions where they are. This tends to maintain alder, slowing down the natural succession pattern toward ash dominance, and sometimes this can go on for decades. Since beaver activity was not homogeneous around the lake, we believe that this could explain the coexistence of ash and alder swamps right now in similar HGM settings. Finally, the results of our models show that some types of wetlands could be more resilient to water level changes than others. The length of the bars on this graph represent the percentage of the total studied area that was covered by our 4 site categories. And as you can see, orange and purple bars, which represent peatlands and alder swamps, show close to no change in response to our scenarios. As I've mentioned before, peatlands were found on floating mats and alder swamps were strongly influenced by surface water connectivity, and so this could explain their resilience to water level changes. However, this was not the case for ash swamps. While they were robust to changes in the 0.5 meter scenarios, they were not resilient in the 2 meter scenarios. If water level increased by 2 meters, our model suggests that 13% of the studied area could be converted from forest to ash swamp, so we would gain wetlands. But in the -2 meter scenario, our model rather suggests a 20% loss of total wetland area. These results are particularly interesting when you take into account the history of the lake. Now, the dam construction raised water level by 2.4 meters, and so our models suggest that this construction led to the creation of a lot of ash swamps, and they happen to be the richest type of wetlands in terms of species in our study. So if the dam was removed, it could not only have major impacts on surface water connectivity, but also on the integrity and total area of wetlands, especially concerning ash swamps. So in conclusion, what our study has shown is that while peatlands were quite unique, alder and ash swamps had more things in common, and this could be explained by a combination of historical changes and beaver activity. So this shows us that local context matters. We also showed that HGM predictors alone could be very good predictors of leakage wetland typology, especially elevation and slope. Finally, we showed that different climatic and land use change scenarios could trigger very different response in leakage wetland types, and so this should be kept in mind when carrying conservation efforts. And last but not least, I want to thank everyone who is involved in this project, especially Stéphanie Pellerin and Raphaël Proux, which are my co-director, as well as Marie Larocque, which is highly involved in this project. I also want to thank all of the people who work at Canuck Institute and Canuck Nature, as well as all of my colleagues in the lab and in the field. Thank you for listening and have a great SER.